All right, so before we get started, well, let's pray and then we'll talk about a couple things. So, Father God, we thank you, as always, for the multitude of your blessings, Lord God, for the opportunity to gather. We thank you for this beautiful day. Gave us a promise of some spring yet to come. I think most of us appreciate that. But we also just want to invite you here, Lord God. Let your spirit rule and reign. Help our hearts to fully comprehend and grasp what you would have us to learn and to know about you through our study tonight. So we invite you here, ask your blessings upon everyone who's come, and we just give you thanks for it in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so a couple of apologies. One, sorry for last week. If anybody didn't get the message, I understand somebody besides Joe and Jamie were here. So try to get the word out. I figured the app on the phone is usually the best way to make that work. But anyway, so apologize if you didn't. I looked at the roads like at noon and went, boy, this looks like it could be terrible. It goes back under freezing at 5 o'clock or something. And I just didn't want an ice rink in the parking lot, an ice rink on the roads, and thought maybe for the last time of the season we'll cancel a class. So we got that. And then, so tonight we're working through a package of notes. I don't want to be confusing anybody. So there's a package out there in the back that says 5.2 on the top, and then somewhere deeper inside it says 5.3, because I combined those two sets of notes into one package for you. And so you'll like see page 1, 2, 3, 4 or whatever, and then it'll start again, page 1, page 2, page 3, whatever. And so that's how you'll follow along in the notes. We're in that second section, and it's in let me find the right page and all such things. I think it's page 2 on the second section. Yeah, thank you. I would love it when people have exact notes as where we left off. So it's almost 2/3 of the way down under letter I, Christianity and dualism. So that's where we're getting started. And just as a kind of a little bit of a reminder or review from where we were a couple of weeks ago. So, we've been in the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist book. They got all the way up into the line of argumentation about what is the true reality of the world that we live in, up to the point of the moral law. And their treatment of the moral law is one chapter, and about a third of that chapter seems to be, directly pulled from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And so I thought we'd at least take some of the salient points out of that, switch over to Mere Christianity, talk about that. And of course, he divides his single book called Mere Christianity up into what he calls book 1, book 2, book 3. And so we kind of covered book 1 and started getting into book 2 last week. Book 1 was talking about the reality and seemingly undeniable presence that all human beings are aware of this moral law that we live under. We know that we break it. We know that we're not observant to it, but we also recognize it seems to exist, and we seem to always want other people to obey it, even if we choose that in our own lives we don't really want to obey it for ourselves all that often. And so he gave a lot of examples. He loves to give a number of examples and ways to think about things. I hope that was beneficial to you in reading the book or going through the class that we did a couple of weeks ago. So, and then both in Mere Christianity, when we're going to stay with that for tonight for the most part, before we switch out, and then in the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist book, both of them are kind of ready to launch into, okay, so we're done with those lines of argumentation. And from the concept of I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, their statement in every one of these lines of evidence, they might say, look, we may not have proven it to the point where it's undeniable, but we certainly believe we've proven our point to the point where I don't have enough faith to believe something else. Right? I don't have enough faith to believe that creation somehow started itself, or that it wasn't God who started creation, because we have a beginning, and a beginning requires a beginner. And then we look at design, and even that book was written a little over 20 years ago, I think now. And our understanding of the design of things in the universe at the very small level, or with the James Webb Space Telescope looking deep, deep out into space, we see design everywhere. And so we continue to say, boy, it sure seems like I don't have enough faith to believe that design comes without a designer. Right. And then we also looked at, from their perspective, the moral law, and said, I don't have enough faith to believe that all people seem to know about this moral law, and dismiss the idea that there's a moral law giver. So that's their kind of perspective, is say, which requires more faith? That these things all happen by accident, or they're all just human conventions that are seemingly best to operate the world in, or did they actually have a source that originated and exists really outside of the universe before we get to that point? So they're both moving towards this point, and I thought we'd stay with C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity as he's starting to do a little very quick. There's nothing extensive or highly detailed about a comparative religion that he's doing. He basically just says, look, you got a couple of choices. You've got non-theism and or pantheism, and you've got theism. And so he just kind of breaks it down into this thing. So he says, look, atheism is a boy's philosophy, right? That's his kind of summary of the whole thing. And he's criticizing himself because he used to be an atheist, but he's saying it was a boy's philosophy. It's way too simple to just say, well, it's all just, you throw enough time and chance and whatever into things, and somehow, some way, it all just works out. And so that's just a boy's philosophy using his terminology. Then he got into pantheism, everything is God and God is everything. And, there's no such thing as good and evil in this sense. It's just is. All of those kind of pantheism descriptions. And he said, that's not working. We recognize, no, there really is. My understanding is there is good and evil. I can say this meets a standard, or this tries to accomplish the standard of good in the world. And this clearly is against that standard, or some action or some person's behavior is against it. And so he's moving into, so he's already now at this point in our study said, look, we need to deal with theistic viewpoints of things. There is a theistic view. And so he does list Judaism and Islam, but he really doesn't talk about them. He doesn't really ever, use them as an example to explain why. We will see a little bit more of that when we switch back into the I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. They will look at it and they will categorize a little bit more, with a little bit more detail. Certainly not a comparative religion in that chapter of I don't have enough faith either. But there's going to be at least a description. These seem to meet the box top of life, if you remember that, analogy they like to use, and these don't. And so there's going to, wipe out a whole slew of clearly non-theistic or partially theistic viewpoints, again, leaving us with Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And then both authors, or both books, seem to just go, look, if we can prove Christianity, then by default we're disproving Islam and Judaism in terms of it's incomplete. There's nothing wrong with the Old Testament. There's nothing wrong with Judaism, but it's clearly incomplete, especially with all the prophecies about the Messiah coming, and that could only be fulfilled in the time period when there was a temple standing in Israel and a high priest in operation and all of those things that were part of that. So both authors are really trying to say, look, if we throw all the darts at Christianity and Christianity survives all of our analysis, then Judaism could at best be partially correct, and Islam is certainly incorrect because it certainly disagrees with what we've already proven to be true with Christianity. But C.S. Lewis does throw in, this is where we left off 2 weeks ago, is C.S. Lewis throws in something that I think most of us have probably never heard of, and maybe it's because I haven't really studied it, whether dualism was something that existed 70 years ago or 100 years ago and has fallen by the wayside, or if it's just something that C.S. Lewis picked up somewhere along the way. Anyway, this is really interesting to talk about. The reason why I'm going to spend a significant portion, or at least a portion of tonight, really delving into dualism as compared to Christianity, is because it really does do a great job of setting up the person and the problem of Satan that does match with a Christian worldview or a biblical understanding of things. So he's not asserting in here any of this is true, but he does kind of make the claim, well, of all the philosophies or all the religious systems that I viewpoint, Christianity and dualism seem to have the most meat on the bones. They have the most things I can really talk about and compare and figure out, is there something going on here? So philosophically, as a philosopher that Lewis is, he really likes dualism as a thing to think about or talk about. But really, it helps us mostly in this study, and from my perspective, to learn about Satan. Okay, and so we're going to talk about that. So that's where we're at now. So that was on the bottom of page 2 of the 5.3 version of the notes. So Christianity and dualism seem to be, from Lewis's then progression here, the only remaining theistic worldviews, meaning theism, meaning there is a God who has the power to create and do the things that he's done. Theistic worldview that addresses the reality of what we can observe. Everything else just doesn't seem to fall into line with truth and reality. So if you don't know, and most of you probably don't unless you've read the book, dualism asserts that there are two equal and independent powers that are engaged in this battle. Okay. One of those powers appears from our observation to prefer good, and the other seems by our observation to prefer bad. Okay. Both powers are, again, speculated, because we don't know them, see them, have any evidence of them, are speculated to be eternal. Neither the good power nor the bad power made each other. They just sort of popped in, they're co-equals. They're sort of this God thing, but one really likes or prefers or acts in a way that is good, exceedingly good, more in line with good than any human being. And one prefers badness to the point where it's worse than any human being we've ever observed in all of history. Okay, they just prefer completely polar opposite viewpoints of their behaviors and their actions and preferences. So the bad one over here hates or likes hatred and cruelty, while the good one likes love and mercy. If these powers actually existed, would it be just a preference that the one has, or that maybe us as observers, that men actually prefer love and mercy over hatred and cruelty? Okay, is it just our preference? Like some like chocolate and some like vanilla, some like bananas and some like apples. Is it just a preference, or is there something else going on that would say, well, I seem to, and most people seem to line up with mercy and love seem to be great traits, and wickedness and cruelty and all of these things are really bad. Okay, that's just is it preference, or is it really factual that good is good and bad is actually bad? If it's merely preference, though, Lewis postulates we must give up the terms like good or evil. It just is. Got this one power that somehow is involved in our creation that likes goodness, and another power that's somehow involved in our existence that prefers evil, badness, whatever it is. We just have to give up the terms because they're co-equals and neither one of them is right or wrong. They just are what they are. So by our own observations already in understanding things like goodness and people saying, people stealing or raping or murdering or whatever these things are, we go, that's an offense against me. I don't like it. It's wrong. We don't just say, I don't like it. We actually say it's wrong for you to murder somebody. It's wrong for you to engage in child abuse. It's wrong for all of these other immoral actions. So we know that good and evil are not just preferences. We really seem to have hopefully proven that in the first part, or in book 1 of C.S. Lewis's Christianity, Mere Christianity. So they're not just preferences. So we must claim that one of these two powers is actually right in dualism, and the other is actually wrong. Love and mercy is actually right for the world and for humanity and everything else, and wickedness and evil and cruelty are actually wrong. But this, making a declaration such as the good power is the right one and the bad power is the wrong one, puts a third power, or a third at least concept, into play that's over and above these two co-equal powers. And we look at it and say, well, one of these two powers more closely conforms to this third thing, right? What goodness is as an objective standard, and the other one almost in no way conforms to it. So we've now put something else above that says, even though they're co-equals, even though they are eternal, even though they have unlimited power and everything, and they are somehow responsible for the world that exists, one of them is right, one of them is wrong, but we don't know what right and wrong are unless something else above and beyond those two things tells us what's right and what's wrong. So whoever or whatever made this standard that we are comparing the goodness versus cruelty or whatever to would be the real God or the real power, and not the good and evil powers in their struggle for dominance, right? There's something that stands above it that tells us good is good, evil is evil. Okay. So then now we have these kind of questions. So now we have that. So then he really says, whatever this third thing is that stands over and above and really is the arbiter between what is right and what is wrong would be the real God. We begin to ask the question, okay, let's talk about this evil, wicked, cruel power that has been hypothesized here. Okay. And that can badness, this is the question for a philosopher and for us tonight, can badness or evil exist independently of goodness or proper actions? Can it actually exist? Can evil exist apart from there actually being something good? He's going to make a case, and hopefully we'll explain it well enough here, that no, it can't actually exist on its own. The bad power of dualism would have to like badness for the sake of badness. But we have no experience with any such motivation or behavior even within what we can observe. Human beings or even invisible spirits or something like that in, demons or Satan or whatever. So people are cruel when we look at this as human behavior, and you can check this against your own experiences and understanding, but people are cruel either because they have a perversion that gives them a perverted pleasure or a desire to gain in some way from an act of cruelty. I mean, I'm going to be cruel, I'm going to be hurting somebody else because I'm going to get something in response to it. Either it's pleasure, or it's power or money, or I'm going to be safe from those who want to harm me in some other way or whatever. But pleasure, power, safety, money are all actually good things. The badness comes in pursuing the good thing in a wrong or corrupted way. Okay? So the person is cruel or wicked because they're pursuing something good, but in the very wrong way. Okay, that's what we see in reality. People can be good for the mere sake of goodness. They can just be good people. God could be good because he's good. But people or some power can't be bad for the mere sake of badness. It just doesn't work that way. We know. So here's some, again, helpful thoughts about it. No one ever did an act of cruelty because cruelty is wrong. It doesn't work that way. The act was done because cruelty was pleasurable or useful to the one who was cruel to somebody, right? They got something in return for it. They weren't being cruel for the sake of cruelness. They were getting something. And even sadists and people who who in some way harm themselves, cut themselves or whatever, they're experiencing something that they're getting out of it. They're not trying to be cruel for the sake of cruelty. They are trying to get some pleasure, some reward, and it's obviously achieved in a very corrupted, bad way. So badness cannot succeed on its own. It requires a corruption of a good thing in order for it to be pursued in an act of badness. All acts of badness, wickedness are a corruption, a distortion of goodness. Okay. We can say it's bad, it's wicked to murder, but why do people commit murder? You might have somebody because I'm angry because somebody slept with my wife. You might have somebody, I murdered because I wanted to steal their property and they were in my way. They might murder because I get some sadistic pleasure out of seeing people die. But it's always something, you're pursuing something good in a very wrong way. So goodness is goodness. It doesn't need any qualifications for it. Badness, we can just define as spoiled goodness. Okay, it's pursuing something that actually has value or goodness in a very wrong way. So there must be something originally good in order for it to become spoiled. Okay, this is another philosophical type conclusion. In order for it to be spoiled into wickedness or cruelty or evil or something, it had to start out good. Or had to have a known source of good because I'm pursuing something good, but I'm doing it in an incorrect way. So in order to classify something like sadism as a sexual perversion, he jumps into this explanation, we must know what proper sexual behavior is. You wouldn't know that some type of sadism is a corruption if you don't know what the good is. Okay? In other words, he uses this concluding statement here. We can explain the perverted by looking at the good. And we say, okay, this is the standard, this is good. Anything that deviates from the standard is obviously a perversion of the good. But if we're looking at perversion, we can't begin to explain, if we never see what good is, we can't begin to explain what good should be if we're only looking at the perverted. But if we're looking at the good, we can say, well, that's good. Anything that moves away from the good aspect of it must be a perversion of the good. That makes sense, right? We have that distinction there. So in order for this hypothesized bad power of dualism to be bad, it must have started out good and then became corrupted in pursuing evil in order to pursuing this evil actions in order to gain good result, but in a bad way. You can't get there from the badness perspective. You just can't get there bad because pursuing something like money or pleasure or power or whatever, those are all good things if they're pursued in the good way. But it's not good to pursue them in the evil, wicked way. Therefore, the bad power of dualism must have received his goodness from the good power, and therefore he can't exist independently of the good power. So we're not dealing with co-equal, eternal, all-powerful beings that are just constantly engaged in this battle. And if you haven't figured out, the reason why he's talking about all this is because, again, we look around the world and we go, well, there's some signs and evidences of really incredible beauty here. But there's also signs of wicked, evil, wrong that we see in the world. And so, there's a dualism as an attempt to explain, well, some things are good and some things are bad. Maybe there's this two equal powers trying to fight out who has enough dominance to control how much good or how much evil's in the world. And when we look at it from this perspective philosophically, we're saying, no, the bad power can't exist as bad all by itself. Because what it's doing is trying to get something good in the incorrect way. So in order to exist, the bad power must have been granted existence, intelligence, and a will. But existence, intelligence, and a free will are all good things that did not originate with this bad power. So this explanation of a bad power of dualism then now naturally flows into the biblical description of Satan as a fallen angel. Started out unfallen, started out in the good presence of God, created in the, when God declared things as good. So he started out good. That is, he was once good, but his goodness was then corrupted by pursuing something good in a corrupted way. Right? So without cracking open Scripture, we're starting now to get a little insight into what the Scriptures talk about as Satan being a fallen angel. Started out good, pursuing good pursuits in a bad way. God gave, when we look at Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, we see evidences that God gave Satan a great deal of responsibility and wanted him to pursue that in a very good way. But he wanted that goodness, but he wanted it in a different way than God had prescribed, and that resulted in his fall and corruption. So, therefore, and this whole discussion here about dualism, C.S. Lewis concludes, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work because badness can't exist as its own entity. It has to be a corruption of the good. And on this, Christianity agrees that the universe is at war now, but not among equal powers, which maybe Mormonism or something might try to claim with Satan and Jesus being brothers or whatever. But it's not a war of equal powers. Lewis calls it a civil war. It's a rebellion. There's a war going on in the world, the domain that we live in as human beings. And it's not a war among equal powers. It's a civil war, a rebellion, where a very powerful, very intelligent being was corrupted, fallen, and is now wreaking havoc on the world with as much leash as God has given him to use. So Christianity is the account then. So then this rolls into the Christian story. We're not really doing a discussion here about the Christian doctrine, but this is a good point from his in the progression of his text. So Christianity is the account, right? Not Judaism, not certainly not Islam, but Judaism transitioning into Christianity is the account of how a rightful king, the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, landed in enemy-occupied territory in disguise, okay, and is calling his followers, Christians, to engage in a campaign of sabotage against the true ruler of this world and this age who exists today, right? And remember that Christ says that Satan is the father of lies, Satan is the ruler of this age, and so Christianity is here comes Christ. He comes not as this incredibly powerful, glowing king who destroys every wicked thing as he comes in judgment, but he comes as a lowly baby born in a manger, and he's despised and rejected by even those who are close companions to him. And he goes to the cross and he suffers and dies, and even his disciples scratch their head while he's in the tomb, and they scratch, was he really the Son of God? And they begin to question and doubt. It's all this intentional, very, very subtle coming to this earth. And then he's gathering an army together of Christians to engage in a campaign against Satan. Not necessarily against unbelievers. We want to build the kingdom with unbelievers becoming believers, but to actually push back against the wiles and the schemes of the wicked one, the enemy, and let his domain decrease while God's domain increases through our participation. So that's just a quick summary of jumping out of dualism into a Christian doctrine, talking about Satan being the ruler of this world and how he began to come in more of a subtle way than in a incredibly powerful way as the God of the universe or as the King of Kings. So the Bible and the church attendance, so he's going to switch into there. The Bible and church attendance gives us orders from the king on how to defeat the enemy. Why do we go to church? Why do we read the Bible? Because it gives us instructions from our general, Jesus Christ, the King of Kings, to tell us, here's how I want you to engage in this battle. So you read your Bible and you go to church to help figure out the best ways of understanding in our own walk how we can defeat the enemy, or how, as we, once we have enough strength on our own with the power of the Spirit working in us, then we can help others defeat the enemy and his presence in their life. Okay, that is why, again, this is a quote from Lewis, or a paraphrase. That is why Satan desires to keep people from both the Bible and going to church. Okay, his weapons that he uses to keep us from reading the Bible and going to church are playing on our human conceit and our laziness and our intellectual snobbery, right? We think I'm exactly where I need to be. I don't need any of this church stuff. I don't need any of this Bible stuff. Lewis is postulating here, Satan is using our own conceit. I'm really a good person. I don't need this Christian stuff. Or I'm just, I've got other things to do, and I don't need to read the Bible, and I don't need to go to church. Or our intellectual snobbery. I've got it all figured out. I can't tell you the number of times I've had people say to me something like, well, when I get to heaven, God and I will have a conversation and he'll figure out where I'm coming from and we'll all just be fine, right? I can't tell you how many times that kind of thinking creeps into things. People thinking they're going to conform God to their preferences. Okay, so then I think this now transitions us into chapter 3. What's the shocking alternative to this whole thought process about dualism and recognizing it doesn't work, but it has the seed plot, if you will, of something that does work within Christianity. So, is the evil power, we'll call him Satan, is the evil power that has made himself prince of this world, does he operate within God's will or not? And those who don't spend time in the Bible, don't spend time learning from, pastors or teachers or whatever in their own study, they might ask this question. It's a very valid question. There's nothing wrong with answering that question if you haven't studied to understand the doctrine. But people will say, if Satan exists, is he doing God's will, or is he against God's will? Or why does God allow him any will in the first place? Okay. So what we need to begin at the beginning, both with Satan and with mankind. God created beings, both angelic and human, that have free will. And it means that creatures who have free will then obviously have the capacity to either do right or wrong with their free will. This starts at the top with Satan, and it goes all the way to us. If he created us as beings with a free moral agent, able to make a choice, then there must be a real choice. So could there ever be any real choice in our lives or in the life of a being like Satan if wrongness or badness or sin wasn't an option? Is it really any choice? And so if you're reading through the book, Lewis begins a discussion of things like automatons. The phrase he used, I assume he means robotic or pre-programmed beings, right? Something that has no option, no free will at all. So but we have to recognize, if something is free to be good, then it naturally must also be free to be bad. Okay? It is the granting of the free will that makes evil possible. Okay? God has granted free will to Satan, to angels, to humanity at a minimum. Okay? A world with creatures that function like pre-programmed machines, automatons, would hardly be worth creating in the first place. Okay. Can you imagine if you had the power or the skills to build a little city of robots, okay, and those robots did exactly what you told them to do, and you lived in eternity, and you sat there watching robots doing exactly what you programmed to do? How bored would you get? Would it be anything interesting or entertaining whatsoever to just have 1,000 or 1,000,000 or whatever things just doing exactly what you did? I'm master of this universe, and I just control every single thought that they think and everything that they do. Would there be? It seems like most of us would just get incredibly bored because I already know what they're going to do. There's no predictive. There's nothing else, right? So the creatures that function like pre-programmed machines would seem to be hardly worth creating. And that's, Lewis's speculation. But what the point here is that the expression of love demands freedom. Love is not possible without a free will. It's simply not possible. If I built a robot, certainly wouldn't do it, but if I built a robot that walked up to me every time I walked in my house that said, "Scott, I love you," what meaning would that have to me? I programmed it to say, "I love you." Would I really feel this warm sense of love because this robot I programmed said, "I love you" every time I walked in the door? It would only be meaningful if it had a choice to love me or not to love me. Just like a spouse or a child or a dog even that has the choice to say, "I choose you, I love you." It gives me something in return for my willingness, or what I give them, I get something back in return of this expression of love. A robot that tells me it loves me would be meaningless. Maybe you like it for the first day or week or who knows what, but you're not going to find it anything interesting after some period of time because it's just doing what it was programmed to do. So, of course, God knew that his creatures could choose to do evil, but apparently he thought it was worth this risk, if you will, in order for him to offer love to us and for us to be able to offer love back to him in response to being created and in response to being loved by him. So apparently, more than creating robots that just simply do everything the creator wants us to do, he created beings that have a free moral agency because he wanted to show these free moral agents, "I love you." It's by choice because you're clearly not on my level. And many of you have even fallen into sin, done something that is completely objectionable to my standards, but I can show you love even though you don't deserve it. And then he can request, "If you love me, then will you follow me? Will you do what I ask of you?" By choice, not by overriding command of our wills. So perhaps someone, an objector, a skeptic might say, or desire to argue with God about, he should never have given us free will in the first place because look how awful the world is. But of course, arguing with God is always a losing proposition. He can never be wrong, but we often are, right? So we can argue, God, it just doesn't seem right, doesn't seem fair, doesn't what blah, 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 that you made people and angels even with free will. But he's the one who did it. And it seems to be consistent with this expression of love and his willingness to share it and give it, as well as being strongly desiring to receive it, but only to receive it from a free will moral agent who wants to give it back. So if God thinks this state that we live in of war between good, God's goodness, and evil, Satan, the ruler of this world, and his influence that he has over human beings, in order for that to happen, we have this understanding that if this creatures do in fact have free will, God must have thought by our own observation or our own philosophical conclusions that it was worth the cost. And then we should accept that if it is good and proper for us to live in this state of tension between an evil, wicked force and God who's good, who's calling us to his goodness, it's worth it to God, and we should probably accept we're going to live in this state until he decides it's time to change it. Okay? And so it seems good, right, moral to follow into that category. So here's some just realities again as we look and unpack by example about this free will moral agency and the ability to choose good versus bad. So his first stage, I'm not sure if it's the one I would have picked, but he chooses a cow. Okay. And he says a cow cannot be exceedingly good or bad. It's pretty much just a cow. Okay. I mean, it might kick at you a little bit and, whatever, but a cow just can only go so far in its badness against the world that it hates maybe or something. Okay. And it can't really go and be all that good. There's only so limited. You compare that to a dog and you say, wait a minute, a dog seems to have a lot more capacity to get into trouble and to, really show human beings companionship and love in something, right? And then we compare that, let's say the next stage or level something up would be a child, and who's not fully developed in mental and emotional capacities, but a child certainly has more abilities to give and receive love than a dog. Okay, and to be either good or bad compared to a dog even. They can just get in a lot more trouble. More skills to get into trouble, even at age 5 or age 10 or something, right? A man of genius, even more so, they can do really good things with their genius, or they can do really wicked things with their genius. Okay? How about that compared to an angelic being? Angels are superior in intelligence and power to any human being. That begins to give us a picture of how bad Satan can be. Far worse than any human being because he's more intelligent and more powerful. So you see, as you go from cow to dog to child to human being to Satan, you get a greater range of potential. Far greater good possible outcomes, but also if the free will choice is far greater negative, bad, wicked outcomes. The range is greater than with a cow or a dog or a child or a man. So that's where that's the understanding of this tension in the world that we live in. No one's saying the world we live in is right. It clearly has gone astray, but it's gone astray by the influence and the rulership of Satan, a fallen angel. So the moment a creature has self-will is the moment it is in danger of putting itself first and therefore being out of order with God's will for its purposes. God doesn't want anybody to say, well, I'm going to supersede God, as if somehow the creature can overrun the creator, which is exactly what Satan tried to do. But the moment he gives us this free will is the very moment we can look around and go, well, I sure like to be my own God. I'd sure like to do something that God has not told me I can do or do something he's told me I can't do. We see this starting to happen. Okay. So Satan's sin emerged out of his enormous capacity that was given to him by his creator to do either good or bad, but he had a free will in order to choose. And he chose poorly. Satan corrupts human thinking by convincing us that we can be our own gods. Okay, we already talked about, the conceit and all that kind of stuff, but he's corrupted humanity from the time of Adam and Eve, like very much in the Garden of Eden. He convinced them, you can be like God. Okay, take of the fruit, tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you can be like God. And he's still using his same tactics, convincing people, you can be your own God. You don't need to submit to anyone else. You can be your own master of your own universe. And he's telling us we can be our own gods. Okay, in ways of things like giving credit to our existence, of our very existence, to something like ourselves. Oh, I'm just so good. I'm just great. I'm a super intelligent and I'm super talented and I can dunk a ball like Michael Jordan and I'm so good at everything that I am because of me, rather than giving credit to our existence, to our creator. And that obviously lines up very much so with evolutionary thinking, right? We just came through the goo and the zoo and all of that, and somehow we're just the best of the best, and so I don't need to answer to anyone else. Declaring ourselves to be our own masters is another form of just being our own God, and inventing a form of happiness apart from God who created us. We're trying to invent human beings that are rebelling and kicking against the goads against God, are trying to gain happiness apart from God. But it's from this corruption that all forms of wickedness have come into the world, telling us we can be our own gods, telling us we're responsible for our own success and happiness, is where this corruption truly comes from. Wickedness has come into the world, things like poverty, ambition, foolish ambition, wars and prostitution and socioeconomic classes and statuses, slavery. All these things come as a corruption of the good because people are pursuing perhaps good things in a very wicked and wrong way. Man fails to find something, and all of these are because what we find is man is always failing to find something to make himself happy apart from God. Okay, you will find lottery winners and billionaires and all kinds of people that seem to be on top of the world in terms of human measures of success, who are miserable, who commit suicide. They're addicted to drugs because they can't find happiness. You can go back and look at Solomon in the Song of Songs, but in Ecclesiastes, where he's like, I've tried every vice I can possibly think of to make myself happy. And what's my conclusion? As the richest man in the world, who has the most power and the most wives and the most concubines and the most everything you can imagine, what does he say is his conclusion of the whole matter? It's all vanity. Nothing satisfies apart from God. He finally gets to that conclusion in chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes. Man is always pursuing happiness and can never seem to find it when it's not found in God, because God didn't build us that way. God built us to be happy in him. And when we reject him, we're trying to find happiness. And I'm not saying that people don't first have seasons of very happy times in their lives. But generally speaking, most people become quite dissatisfied. They're always searching for a new high, always searching for a new experience, always searching for something else that will provide them a fading glory or a fading happiness. And it's in those pursuits they start to go astray. Sometimes you wonder. I mean, do I get to use an example? Like Tiger Woods, right? A ways back, if you know his story, here's the richest athlete in the world, more than $1 billion as an athlete, and by many accounts had an incredibly beautiful wife. And then what does he do? Makes big mistakes in terms of moral execution, trying to find pleasure and happiness in an ungodly way. True happiness apart from God is impossible because he made us to be in relationship with him, and there's no substitute. None of these other things that will ever substitute will ever truly fulfill the lives of human beings the way God is able to satisfy us, because he built us. And he built us with a desire to be in relationship to him and for him to be the source of our happiness, not our own pursuits, okay? Apart from him anyway. So God will not give us happiness apart from himself, because there is no such thing. He built us for relationship with him. And so we have to be in relationship with him if we're going to truly be content, truly be peaceful, truly be happy with our existence. And you can do all kinds of psychological studies and all of that, but you just find, you look at people who seem to be, again, president and CEO of major corporations, whatever, and they sleep with their secretary, they do this, they do that, they make incredibly silly mistakes. And you go, wow, how would you do that? Didn't you know that you would ruin your life and ruin your career? And it's because they want more, and they're unsatisfied, even being, whoever, richest man in the world, the most powerful CEO executive, the most powerful president in the world, it doesn't matter. We find no happiness. Once we've achieved something, it's like, I need more. And we keep striving and never finding the happiness that God built in us to have with him. So all human institutions, whether it's an individual or a corporation or a nation, eventually fail. Because what we find is this: we can study nations throughout history. Think about all these nations. Think about Rome, right? Or any other empire. How did they end up so powerful and then end up so defeated? It's always because some fatal flaw creeps in, usually based on pride or selfishness of those who have some kind of control. Okay, corporations. You can look at, things like Disney. Disney was seriously on the top of the world in terms of having a juggernaut of control over the entire entertainment industry. And then they started making some decisions and start to collapse. That's not entirely because of Christianity, but it's just, you see this kind of life cycles of businesses, corporations, whatever entities may be, because people in charge usually are not pursuing things the way God would have them pursue them, and they eventually fail out of these kinds of pride and arrogance and selfishness that we find in people. So God gave us, I think we're in the next chapter here, is God's response to Satan's corruption and man's complicit rebellion against his will. So point number one, or A, he gave us a conscience. This is what we've been talking about for the last several weeks. He gave us a conscience to tell us what is right and what is wrong. So this is God's response to Satan trying to corrupt the whole of the creation. God gave us a conscience. He's told us these actions are right, good, moral, and consistent with my will. And these other actions are the exact opposite of that. We know right from wrong because he gave it to us. But then when we see the development of the story historically, okay, so we're going to switch to talking about the nation of Israel, coming through Abraham and the nation of Israel. So this is going to get to a point where we present Jesus Christ, okay? So God selected the Jews, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the nation of Israel. He selected the Jews to know firsthand what kind of God he is, right? So up until Abraham, we saw kind of a different God. He sometimes would appear, maybe with Enoch, or even had a conversation with Cain about the right and wrong. But there was this very intense focus on the person of Abraham. God said, I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you, right? This incredible beginning of a relationship. Then transitioning here into the Moses, Mount Sinai, the giving of the moral law, or the whole of the Jewish law. He selected this nation, this group of people, this family, to know firsthand who he is. And one of the first things he wanted us to know, there's one God. Stop praying and thinking and seeking all these false gods that mankind and satanic forces have invented for people. There's only one God. I am that I am, he tells Moses at the burning bush, right? I'm going to defeat all of those false gods of Egypt, right? The river god of the Nile, and the sun god and the moon god, and all the flies and the lice and everything else. I'm going to defeat them all because they're not really powers at all. There's only one God. So he tells the nation of Israel, There's only one God. That's really important as we progress through here. And he also tells them, by giving them 613 commandments at Mount Sinai, he is intensely interested or concerned in our proper conduct. Okay? Do it right. I am holy. You must be holy. He's intensely interested in proper conduct as this one God relationship with Israel. So think about that. That's just a very super quick snapshot of Israel for 1,500 years from Moses to Christ. But then, in the midst of this intensely monotheistic Judaism that existed 2,000 years ago, the Jews, when the nation of Rome was trying to overtake them, they basically stood against Rome and said, "You can kill us, but we will not worship your gods." Right? I mean, there was this, we will not. We are monotheistic. We will not add your God or worship your God. You can kill us. They were to the point of death. They said, we are monotheistic. So this is why I want you to know that, because this is when Jesus comes, who did and said things that are utterly shocking to come from the mouth of any man, but especially a man born of the nation of Israel, speaking to Israelites or Jewish people at his time. He walked around in places, and people try to claim that he didn't, but he really did. He claims to be God. He claims to forgive sins only the way God could forgive sins. He claims to have always existed. Before Abraham was, I am. He claims that he will return at the end of an age to judge all the sins of the world. These are shocking words to be spoken in a monotheistic religion society. So as a Jew, Jesus was not claiming pantheism, right? He's not saying, I'm God, you're God, we're all gods, and I just got a little bit more understanding of this godness that we all are than you do. No, he's in a Jewish society, a monotheistic religion. He's saying, I am God. I forgive sins. I judge sinners. Okay? But rather that the one true God has come as a man, and this is easily the most shocking thing ever to be uttered by human lips. Okay? When he says, I am, and before Abraham was, I am the bread of life, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? All these statements, these are shocking lips, shocking, easily the most absurd and shocking thing that could ever be uttered by human lips for a man in his day. And really, almost in any day. So the claim, let's talk about this, the claim to forgive sins would be preposterous if Jesus wasn't God. And this is all started in that conversation about Jesus. Oh, he's a good moral teacher. He's a good moral teacher. Well, we're going to find you can't be a good moral teacher and claim to forgive sins if you don't have the power to forgive sins. Okay. So a man can forgive sin offenses against himself. Right? You step on my toe, I can forgive you. You steal my checkbook, I can forgive you. But if you steal your checkbook, how am I involved in the forgiveness process? But that's exactly what Jesus said he was involved in. In fact, he actually put himself as the one principally offended by the fact that you stole from you. Not pointing fingers at anybody, right? Not necessarily. All right. So what would we say of an ordinary man who forgives someone for stepping on someone else's toes or stealing someone else's money? C.S. Lewis has used the word asinine fortuity, is how he describes such behavior as forgiving someone else for making a sin that he wasn't even involved in. Yet this is exactly what Jesus did. He forgave sins as if he were the person chiefly offended by all of these sinful actions. This only makes sense if he actually was God, whose laws of good and bad were broken, and if he was actually injured when man sinned by stealing from somebody else, or I don't know that stepping on a toe is a great moral sin, but stealing from somebody else, or committing murder, or adultery, or rape, or something like that. He's saying, I'm chiefly offended, and I'm the one the only one who can truly offer forgiveness for that act, because I was injured when these two human beings did something of violent or immoral actions one against another. Yet even Jesus' enemies, when we read the Gospels, when we read even in historical accounts of Jesus not included in the Bible. Even his enemies never show us or give us the impression that Jesus was somehow silly or conceited when he made these statements. They just don't see it. They just say this man claimed to forgive sins. They don't say it was the stupidest, silliest thing I've ever heard. Why would this man forgive somebody else for a sin not committed against them? His enemies never even accused him of being, off here per se. They didn't like what he said, but they didn't think he was, well, that guy's a lunatic. Okay. Christ says he's humble and meek. No one can utter those words. Hi, I'm Scott. I'm humble and meek. You can't utter those words and be correct about it unless you're God and you say, I am lowly and meek. And no one criticizes or confuses the fact that he really is humble and meek because he's the very God of gods willing to step down into humanity and say, I've come in a form of humility and meekness to the world. And we believe him. We believe him when he says he's humble and meek. We don't even question it. Not noticing that these words are not even accurate descriptions if he was not God. You can't do it. No man can utter the words being, I am humble and meek, and actually be humble and meek, unless he's God. This line of reasoning should prevent anyone from making the foolish statement that Jesus was just a good moral teacher. Jesus only left us with 3 possible conclusions concerning his conduct. Many of you probably heard this, right? There's only 3 possible choices with someone who would make claims to forgive sins, that where he was not involved in the transgression, or that I am humble and meek, or any of the other things that he claimed. He's either a lunatic, like someone claiming to be a poached egg, okay? Or he's a liar. He knows he's not God, but he's walking around telling people he is. Or the only other possibility is he's Lord. Liar, lunatic, and Lord, or lunatic, liar, and Lord. Those seem to be the only 3 possibilities that we can surround with the words that Jesus says. Okay? So we all have to conclude when we see the Gospels, when we see the claims about Christ, is he a lunatic? Is he a liar? Or is he the Lord who actually demonstrated that he is who he demonstrated himself to be, and claims to be? So C.S. Lewis says you can call him a fool, you can spit at him, you can mock him, or you can fall down at his feet and call him Lord and God. These are kind of your choices. Walking around and patronizingly calling him a good human teacher is not something we should do. He didn't leave that option open to us because he didn't intend to. You have to make a decision about who he is. Lunatic, liar, or Lord. All right, let's, with that, close off for our 5-minute break at the bottom of the hour. And we'll come back and see how far we get to the next section.